Welcome back to the IC and D1 series, and in this video we'll be looking at the DTP protocol. So what is DTP? So DTP stands for the Dynamic Trunking Protocol, and all it does, it allows two switches to form a trunk dynamically. So what it does, it allows a switch to dynamically decide whether a port should be an access port or a trunk port. So instead of us having to go into the switch, into the interface, and manually configuring a port as access or trunk, the switch can automatically detect whether that port should be an access or trunk port. So usually, if on the other end of this of a link is another switch, imagine this is switch 1 and this is switch 2. Switch 1 will detect that switch 2 resides at the other end of the link by exchanging DTP messages with switch 2, and it will dynamically form a trunk link, so it'll make this a trunk. If a end device such as a laptop or a PC or a server exists out of a switch port, because those devices don't run DTP, those devices will not be sending DTP messages, because switch 1 will not receive any DTP messages from this device over here. It means that it's going to set this as an access port. So as you can see, DTP is very clever in that it allows the switch to dynamically form a trunk or an access port depending on what kind of device is connected on the other end of that link. So how does DTP work? Well, firstly, for switches to negotiate a trunk via DTP, they must have the same VTP domain name. So when we configure VTP, we have, if we are trying to use VTP, we have to configure a VTP domain name, and with VTP, the switches with the same VTP domain name will share the same VLANs, and switches that don't have the same VTP domain name will not share the same VLANs. So when two switches want to form a trunk link, and they're trying to use DTP to negotiate whether this should be a trunk or an access link, they have to have the same VTP domain name, otherwise they can't use DTP to negotiate a trunk. And we use DTP messages to decide whether the link will be an access or a trunk link. And these messages will list the administrative mode and the operational mode. So the difference between administrative mode and operational mode. Administrative mode is the mode that we configure on the switch port. In the next few slides, you will see the different modes that we can configure, such as access, trunk, dynamic, desirable, and dynamic auto. The administrative mode is what we have configured on the switch port. So the mode that we have configured on the switch port. The operational mode is what this port is acting as. So the operational mode tells us whether this port is acting as an access port or a trunk port. So the different administrative modes. So access, the switch port is hard coded to act as an access port. So if we go into a switch and we type in the command switch port mode access, that port will always be a trunk port. It will not negotiate to be a trunk port. It will always be an access port. It's been hard coded. Trunk forces the link to be a trunk port. So again, if we go into an interface and use the command switch mode trunk, it forces that port to be a trunk port. That port will under no circumstances act as an access port. No negotiate disables the sending of DTP messages. So normally, if we want to hardcode an access or trunk port, but we don't want DTP messages to be sent out, we would use the command switch mode access or switch mode trunk. Then we would use the command switch port mode no negotiate to disable the sending of DTP messages out those ports. Dynamic desirable. This tells the switch to try and actively negotiate a trunk. So with dynamic desirable, the switch will actually use DTP now to try and form a trunk with the device on the other end of that link. So it's going to send DTP messages, and with dynamic desirable, it's going to aggressively and actively try to form a trunk. So it's going to be like to this guy: I want to form a trunk. I want to form a trunk. Now dynamic auto is different. Dynamic auto is a more passive version. So with dynamic auto, it tells the switch to only form a trunk if it receives a DTP message. So in this case, if this guy was set as dynamic auto, it will use DTP to form a trunk, but only if it receives DTP messages first. So with dynamic desirable, the switch is actively sending DTP messages trying to form a trunk. With dynamic auto, the switch will still be sending DTP messages, but it will only form a trunk if it receives DTP messages back. So if we have dynamic auto on both sides, then this link would be an access link. If we have dynamic desirable and dynamic auto, it'll be a trunk link. So with dynamic auto, it's only going to form a trunk if it receives DTP messages from the other side. So dynamic auto and dynamic desirable use DTP. Access and trunk is how we can hard code our switch to be an access or trunk port. Okay, so now this table really lists the admin and operational modes. So if both sides are configured as dynamic auto, that means that port's going to act as an access link. If one side is configured if both sides are configured as dynamic desirable, it means that both links are going to act as the trunk link. Trunk and dynamic auto is trunk. Access and dynamic auto is access. Dynamic auto and dynamic desirable is trunk. Trunk and dynamic desirable is trunk. Access and dynamic desirable is access. Dynamic auto and trunk is trunk. Dynamic desirable and trunk is trunk. Trunk and trunk is trunk. Access and trunk wouldn't work. Dynamic auto and access is access. Dynamic desirable and access is access. Trunk and access is, it doesn't work. Access and access is access. So this table shows that the operational mode of the link, depending on the administrative mode we configure on either end of a port. And we will see this in greater detail when we look at the actual lab for this. So do we use DTP? No, not really. The reason why is because it can introduce a security risk with rogue switches. So if you think about it, if a port can dynamically form a trunk, so if any port could dynamically form a trunk, that causes a big security risk. Imagine if a malicious person connected a rogue device to your switch. Because your switch is by default automatically configured to try and form a trunk, it's going to form a trunk link with this port, with this switch over here, which means that now this rogue switch will be part of your network. Traffic will now flow to this rogue switch, and he'll be able to capture traffic and capture packets. And again, this causes a risk because we don't want, we want to hard code our trunk ports and we want to hard code our access ports. We want to know which ports on our switch are access and which ports are trunk. We don't want to have the possibility that some rogue device can come in and negotiate a trunk with our switch, which means that they're part of our network. If we hard code our ports, that means that only ports that connect to uplinks to switches will be trunk ports, or the other ports will be access ports. That means if someone does connect to our switch, they wouldn't be able to form a trunk because we would have hard coded that port to be an access port. So normally, for security reasons, we hard code our ports. So we hard code our ports to uplinks to switches as trunk ports, and we hard code our ports to end devices as access ports. And normally we hard code unused ports as access ports unless those ports are going to be used in the future for uplinks to another switch. So now let's look at the fields of a DTP message itself. So as you can see, the DTP message will list the domain name of the local switch. It's going to list the trunk status. So it's going to list the operational mode and the administrative mode. So as you can see, this guy's be configured to act as in the administrative mode as dynamic desirable. However, it's acting as an access port. Now, yeah, we can see the trunk type, whether it is an 802.1q trunk or a ISO trunk, and we can see the sending MAC address and the sending Cisco ID of the device itself. So now I'm going to pause the video very quickly. I'm going to bring up a lab and let's see DTP in action. So welcome back. So we're at the command line of switch 2. The lab I have set up is just a 2-switch lab, and we have switch 1, we have switch 2. I'm on switch 2 at the moment. We're going to configure switch 1 with the DTP mode of dynamic desirable, and we're going to configure switch 2 with the DTP mode of dynamic auto. Before we do that, let's just quickly run show interface FA0/1 switch port. Let's quickly run this command to see the administrative mode of the switch. So I haven't done any configuration on switch 2 yet, but we can see that the default administrative mode is dynamic desirable, which means it's going to, by default, it's going to want to try and form a trunk with the device on the other end of that link. The operation mode is down because I've shut down the interface of switch 1, which connects to the switch. But this is a good command to see the kind of administrator mode of your port as well as the operational mode as well. And it shows us that the administrator mode is the dynamic desirable and the operational mode is down. Another show interface, another command you can use is the show interface command. This will show your line protocol, but it shows as down and down. Just two useful commands you can use, but if the main command that you want to use if you want to see the administrative and operational mode of your port would be the show interfaces tab number switchboard command. So now I'm going to go into the running configuration, the global config mode of switch 2, and now we're going to go into interface FA061 and configure it with DTP mode of dynamic auto. Switchboard mode dynamic auto. If I just show question mark, we can see we've got access, dynamic, and trunk. If I issue this command, this is a no negotiation mode. This disables the sending of DTP messages, but we're going to set the mode to auto. Switcher mode dynamic auto, sorry. And we're going to go show run interface FA061. We can see that this command is showing up. So by default, the switchboard mode dynamic desirable command will not show up because it's the default setting on the switch port. If I show run interface FA061 show interface FA061 switch port, we can see that now the administrative mode is dynamic auto, the operation mode is still down. So now I'm going to pause the video quickly, go back to switch 1, and now we will configure switch 1 with the administrator mode of dynamic desirable, and we'll bring the link up and see the DTP messages sent between both devices. So we're now back on switch 1. I've already configured this as the interface FA062 as a dynamic desirable port. So interface FA062 switch port. You see that the administrator mode is dynamic desirable, but the port is down. We're on a show interface FA0/3 switchboard command. But you can see that on this switch, the default administrator mode is dynamic auto. Now this switch one is a 3560, and switch 3560, and the switch 2 is the 2960. So as we can see, if we had two 3560 which over trunk link connected together, they wouldn't form a trunk, because their default administrator modes are dynamic auto, which means that they would wait on each other to try and negotiate and form a trunk. So now I've configured that. I'm going to use command debug DTP packets. I'm going to go on to interface FA062, and we're going to use the no shutdown command to bring the interface back up. So just to be clear, so just to reiterate again, we have switch 1, we have switch 2, dynamic desirable, and dynamic auto. Now I've issued this debug command, and we're going to see the packets travel between two devices and how they can use DTP to negotiate a trunk link. So no shutdown. They've been the trunk link back up, and they should, they're now starting to negotiate DTP messages. In order to negotiate whether this port should be a trunk port or a access port. Enter a U and undebug all command. I'm going to scroll up very quickly. As you can see, they're sending it. So this guy is sending a packet at this port. Is using DTP to not only negotiate whether this port should be an access or trunk port, but to also negotiate the trunking protocol that is to be used over this link. So sending these packets out, and it shows that at the moment its operational mode is access, but its administrative mode is set to desirable, and it's sending those packets out. You can send those packets out. And it's received a DTP packet. This DTP packet says that this guy is part of the same domain as us, and his operation mode is now trunk, and his administrator mode is auto. So as you can see, what's happened, okay, is that switch 2 has received the packet from switch 1 first. It receives the DTP messages saying they want to be trunk. Switch 2 then changes its operation mode to trunk, and then when it's sending its DTP messages to switch 1, it's saying that my administrator mode is dynamic auto, and I'm operating as trunk. That means now switch 1 changes its port to a trunk port. So now when switch 1 sending out its messages, it's saying that it's operating as a trunk port, and its administrator mode is dynamic desirable. So as you can see, by exchanging these DTP messages, switch 1 and switch 2 have negotiated a trunk. Switch 2 received the messages first. Switch 1 said, I want to be a trunk, because switch 2 was running DTP, but running in dynamic auto mode. Once it received those messages, it changes operation mode to trunk, and it starts sending DTP messages to switch 1 as well. Now switch 1, because it's received DTP messages, and because switch 2 is the trunk, switch 1 is gonna make that port a trunk, and now we have a trunk link. And the trunking protocol they've used, and they've negotiated to use 802.1q instead of ISL. So as you can see, they're still sending messages, and they're just reiterating each other that they're a trunk port now. So now if we do the show interfaces trunk, we can see that port FA0/2 is now a trunk port. Its mode is dynamic desirable. It's using 802.1q encapsulation. It was negotiated. These are the VLANs which are allowed over the trunk link. Okay. Now what I'm going to do very quickly, I'm going to now disable the sending of DTP messages over that port. Switch port, no negotiate. Okay, so switch port. I'll code it as the trunk. Then switch port trunk encapsulation .1q. Switch port mode trunk, and now switch port no negotiate. Okay, if we do the show interfaces FA0/1 switch port command, FA0/2 sorry, switch port command, we can see that this guy has been hard coded to act as a trunk and is operating at the trunk link. Now let us see what switch 2 on the other end of the link is operating as. So now we're back to switch 2, we're going to issue the command show interfaces FA0/1 switch port, because if this port is operating, it's still operating as a trunk port. If I use the conf and FA0/1 shutdown, and then no shutdown command, show interfaces FA0/1 support. Yeah, so as you can see, it's not operating as an access port, and the reason why is because if I draw it very quickly, switch 1, switch 2. In the PowerPoint, we saw that when a port was configured as a trunk, the other side was configured as dynamic auto, they would form a trunk. The reason why is that just by configuring switch 1 mode trunk, the switch 1 would still be sending DTP messages to switch 2. And it would list in those DTP messages that it's been hard coded as a trunk port, because this guy is set for dynamic auto, it's going to form a trunk as well. When we use the command switch port no negotiate, switch 1, even though it was configured as a trunk port, it stopped sending DTP messages to switch 2. Then when we brought the interfaces on switch 2 down and up again, switch 2, because it wasn't receiving any DTP messages from switch 1, didn't form a trunk port. It said that because I'm not receiving DTP messages from this port and I set to dynamic auto, I don't know whether the other end of this link is an access or a trunk port. So I'm just going to default to an access port because I'm not receiving any DTP messages, so I can't negotiate with anybody. And so that's why I switched to defaulted to a trunk port. So just remember that when we configure the command switch mode trunk, the switch still sends DTP messages, which means that we can have the other side as dynamic desirable or dynamic auto. However, when we use the command switch mode no negotiate, the switch stops sending DTP messages, which means that the other end of the link has to be hard coded as a trunk port as well. So we've reached the end of this video, and we've seen DTP in quite a lot of detail. We've seen how it can be used to dynamically form a trunk link, and why we wouldn't use it, because it can pose a security risk in our network. If If our ports could automatically negotiate a trunk, it means that somebody could bring in a rogue device, negotiate a trunk link with our switch, and have access to all the VLANs in our network. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.